The night of the fire remains etched in the memories of those who survived it, a brutal and haunting chapter that no one who lived through it would ever forget. But as time has passed and the years have folded into one another, there has been a consistent echo of questions that refuse to die. What truly happened that night? How could something so catastrophic unfold within the walls of a place that, by its very purpose, was meant to safeguard the most vulnerable? The official reports were clear: an accidental fire. It spread quickly, consuming the asylum in a matter of hours. The authorities claimed that due to poor maintenance and an outdated fire suppression system, a spark ignited in the attic, leading to the tragic blaze. The death toll was high, and many of the survivors had to be rescued or managed to escape through sheer luck and determination. But what the reports didn't account for was the confusion, the panic, and the strange inconsistencies in what the survivors remembered versus what the authorities wrote down. What they remembered was different, disturbingly so. Some of them remembered things that the official narrative simply couldn't explain. Some of them said they saw shadows moving within the fire, heard voices they shouldn't have, and smelled things that no one could explain. And then there were the reports that didn't match up. The accounts from the firefighters who arrived at the scene. The official logs from the paramedics. Everyone had their own story to tell, but none of it seemed to fully align with the survivors' versions of events. The discrepancies were small at first, a misplaced detail here, an overlooked fact there, but as time wore on, they became harder to ignore. It was as if everyone involved had either conveniently forgotten or misremembered something crucial. Or worse, were deliberately covering something up. The survivors' memories were shattered by trauma, but even more disturbing was how their recollections contradicted one another. Some survivors insisted they had seen a man near the source of the fire before it began. Others spoke of a strange figure who had appeared in the corridors during the chaos, offering help, then vanishing without a trace. A few reported hearing laughter amidst the panic, strange, unsettling laughter, as if the very air had turned sinister in the face of such devastation. The deeper you dug, the more unsettling the details became. But those who had survived the fire weren't the only ones left with doubts. The investigators who were tasked with uncovering the truth quickly became frustrated by the lack of clarity. In their pursuit of answers, they discovered that the asylum was riddled with flaws, both in its structure and in its management. There were claims that the building had not been up to code for years, that fire drills were rarely conducted, and that the staff were either ill-trained or ill-prepared to deal with an emergency of this magnitude. Yet despite all this, there was a nagging sense that something more was at play. Perhaps the fire wasn't just the result of negligence. What if it had been a deliberate act? And if it had been, who would have been responsible? As investigators questioned those who had worked at the asylum, it became evident that the staff's responses were evasive, almost rehearsed. Some of the nurses who had been on duty during the fire seemed to be hiding something, unwilling to speak openly about the events of that night. They would all tell the same story, what they had seen and heard, but none of them could provide a clear explanation for the inconsistencies that were emerging from the survivors' accounts. They painted a picture of a nightmarish situation, but there was something about their accounts that felt incomplete. And then there were the whispers from those who had worked behind the scenes, people who had been involved in the asylum's operations but were no longer in the picture. Whispers that hinted at something more sinister: illegal experiments, cover-ups, and a disturbing history of unethical practices. One survivor, in particular, seemed to know more than they were letting on. At first, they had been hesitant to talk. Their memories of the fire were fragmented, and the trauma was still raw. But as time passed, and with a little encouragement, they began to open up. They spoke of strange things, things that didn't match the official story. They recalled seeing shadowy figures walking through the smoke, figures that didn't look like staff members or patients. They heard voices in the chaos, whispers in the heat of the flames, but no one else had heard them. The survivors' words were cryptic and filled with uncertainty, but there was something unsettling about them, something that gnawed at the edges of the investigation. The survivor was not alone in their strange recollections. Another spoke of hearing the voice of a patient who had died in the fire calling out for help. Yet, according to the official records, that patient had never been near the area where the fire had started. How could their voice have been heard? Were these just the symptoms of trauma, the mind playing tricks on the body in a desperate attempt to make sense of the horror? Or was there something else at play? The more questions arose, the more the survivors' accounts diverged from reality as everyone knew it. But if the survivors were telling the truth, then the official reports had to be wrong. And if the reports were wrong, then what had really happened that night? Could the fire have been something more than just a tragedy? Could it have been a warning? A reckoning for something darker and more insidious within the asylum's walls? As the investigation continued, the cracks in the story began to widen, and the implications grew ever more disturbing. The deeper the investigators dug, the more questions they unearthed, questions that didn't have easy answers. What had really been happening at the asylum before the fire? What had been hidden from the public eye for so long? And why did the survivors remember things that no one else seemed to? Was it simply the trauma speaking, or was there something they knew that no one else was willing to acknowledge? The unsettling truth was that no one seemed to know for sure. The fire was a tragedy, yes, but the mystery surrounding it seemed to go beyond the flames. The survivors had seen something, felt something, that was far more chilling than the destruction itself. And as the investigation continued, the answer seemed further and further out of reach. There were only more questions, each more troubling than the last. Who was responsible? What happened in the moments before the fire began? And most importantly, what truths had been buried in the ashes? As the night of the fire was reconstructed from multiple angles, all the pieces seemed to fit together in an unsettling pattern, but with holes, large, gaping holes, where the real answers should have been. The mystery didn't just lie in the fire itself, but in the way it had been covered up. And in the survivors' haunted recollections, the faint echo of something far more sinister remained. Every time the official report tried to tie up loose ends, another survivor would step forward with a new, disturbing details that couldn't be explained by trauma alone. Slowly but surely, the survivors' memories began to suggest that the fire was no accident. It was a carefully constructed lie. But who would benefit from such a cover-up? And what exactly was being hidden? The deeper the investigation went, the more terrifying the implications became. This wasn't just about a fire. It was about what lay beneath it in the dark corners of the asylum. Something far darker. Something no one was willing to admit. The truth, it seemed, was something no one could or would reveal. And so, the mystery of the asylum fire lingers on, a chilling tale of deception, trauma, and untold secrets. The fire may have been extinguished, but the questions remain unanswered, like embers still smoldering in the dark. The asylum was a place of whispers, a building that stood like a silent sentinel on the outskirts of the town, its tall, foreboding walls hiding untold secrets. To the outside world, it was a place meant for healing and care, but to those who lived there, it was something far different. A prison of forgotten souls. The institution's grand design was meant to impress, but behind its ornate doors and high windows lay an undercurrent of darkness that nobody seemed willing to confront. It wasn't just the crumbling infrastructure or the eerie isolation of the patients that made the place feel haunted. It was something deeper, something rooted in the very history of the building itself. Built in the late 1800s, the asylum was once considered state-of-the-art, an answer to the increasing numbers of those deemed mentally unstable by society. For years, it was the pinnacle of modern mental health care, a place where people were sent with the hope that they would be cured or at the very least, contained. It was, however, a place where the lines between care and cruelty were often blurred. Many of those sent there were forgotten by their families, hidden away in rooms where their voices wouldn't be heard. The patients came from all walks of life, but what they all shared was the quiet suffering of being trapped in a system that was supposed to help them but often made their situations worse. Despite the early promises of reform, the asylum soon became known for its horrific treatment of patients. Medical practices that were once considered cutting-edge, shock therapy, lobotomies, and other primitive treatments, were frequently administered with little regard for the actual well-being of the patients. Many of the staff were undertrained, their attitudes cold and indifferent, as if they were simply biding their time until their shifts were over. The patients, meanwhile, languished in isolation, their humanity stripped away, reduced to little more than numbers on a ledger. But it wasn't just the patients who suffered. There were rumors of corruption in the administration, stories of funds being misused, of staff turning a blind eye to neglect, and whispers of strange, unethical experiments carried out in the dark corners of the institution. Those who managed to escape the asylum spoke of a place where the walls seemed to pulse with a kind of malevolent energy, where the air was thick with the scent of something rancid and decaying. The patients were often treated like animals, their cries and pleas for help going unheard, drowned out by the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the place. Many of the staff were either complicit in or oblivious to the suffering taking place around them. The asylum wasn't a sanctuary, it was a fortress, one built to contain the broken minds of those it housed, not to heal them. Over time, the place became less about treatment and more about containment. And in that containment, there were those who saw an opportunity to exploit the patients for personal gain. Behind the closed doors of the asylum, there were rumors that would later resurface after the fire, that some patients were being used in horrific experiments, their lives manipulated for the sake of research. These whispers came from staff members who had once worked there, those who had seen what was really happening behind the scenes but were too afraid to speak out. The asylum's administration, they claimed, was involved in testing new drugs, some of which were unapproved, on vulnerable patients. The patients, unable to communicate their pain or discomfort, were subjected to these trials without their consent. Some died in the process, while others were left in permanent states of confusion or disfigurement. The experiments weren't just about mental health, they were about control, about asserting power over those who had no way to resist. But as dark as these rumors were, they paled in comparison to the allegations that would come to light much later. The institution's isolation, its remote location, made it easy to carry out these experiments in secret, and even easier to sweep the bodies, metaphorically and literally, under the rug. It wasn't just the patients who were at risk. The staff who questioned the administration's motives were often silenced, either through intimidation or through being quietly pushed out of the institution. The truth, it seemed, was always just beyond reach. And then there were the stories of disappearances. Patients who seemed to vanish without a trace, their names erased from records, their existence wiped from history. Some believed they had died in the fire. Others claimed they had been moved to a different facility, or worse, that they had simply been forgotten. These disappearances weren't random, they were part of a larger pattern, a system in which people were erased when they became inconvenient. The asylum had a dark history, but it wasn't a history anyone wanted to revisit. It was only when the fire happened that people began to look more closely at the asylum's past, to ask the questions that had been ignored for decades. How had the institution been allowed to operate so long with such blatant disregard for the welfare of its residents? What had been hidden behind those walls for so many years? The fire itself became a catalyst for this reckoning, though many believed the answers were buried deep in the ashes. What had really happened inside the asylum? Were the survivors simply remembering things wrong as the official report claimed, or had they witnessed something that was intentionally erased from history? The fire that consumed the asylum may have destroyed the building, but it also exposed cracks in the foundation of the institution's carefully crafted facade. As the survivors began to tell their stories, each account seemed to open up a new layer of mystery, revealing more than just the horror of that night. They spoke of strange occurrences, things they had seen before the fire, things that made them question everything they had been told. One survivor, in particular, recalled hearing voices in the hallways just before the flames broke out, voices that seemed to be coming from nowhere, whispers that sounded too deliberate to be the ramblings of a panic-stricken mind. Others spoke of seeing shadows moving in the smoke, figures that they couldn't identify, figures that seemed to be walking through the fire without fear or hesitation. Some survivors swore they saw people they knew, people who had been dead for years, staring at them through the smoke. These recollections, while disturbing, only deepened the mystery. The official reports made no mention of these strange occurrences. In fact, the reports offered a very straightforward explanation: an accidental fire caused by faulty wiring or perhaps a carelessly discarded cigarette. The building's poor maintenance had allowed the fire to spread quickly, and the chaos that followed was simply the result of bad luck. Yet, the survivors' memories told a different story. They spoke of something far darker, something that went beyond mere neglect or coincidence. Could the fire have been more than just an accident? Could there have been something else behind it, something that the authorities were either unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge? As the investigation progressed, it became clear that there was more to the story than anyone had realized. The asylum had been a place of secrets for years, and those secrets were beginning to resurface in ways that nobody had anticipated. The survivors were remembering things that didn't fit with the official narrative, things that hinted at a much deeper and more sinister truth. And as the investigation dug deeper into the asylum's history, it became evident that the fire, while tragic, may have been the culmination of a much longer and more troubling story, one that had been carefully concealed for far too long. The walls of the asylum had held more than just the patients' cries, they had held a dark truth, a truth that was now beginning to reveal itself. But with each new revelation, the questions only grew more troubling. What happened behind those walls, and who was responsible for the destruction that followed? The answers, it seemed, were hidden in the past, buried beneath layers of lies, corruption, and fear. And it was only with the survivors' memories, their fractured and fragmented accounts, that the true story of what happened in the asylum would finally begin to come to light. But even then, the truth seemed elusive, slipping further and further away as the investigation pressed on. The more the survivors remembered, the less clear the picture became. What had truly happened that night, and why had the fire taken place? Only time would tell if the answers would ever be uncovered, or if the asylum's secrets would remain buried forever. The night the fire tore through the asylum was not an ordinary one. The air was thick with smoke, panic, and confusion as the flames consumed everything in their path. For the survivors, the events of that night were seared into their memories, each moment a vivid, haunting image they would carry for the rest of their lives. Yet, as the dust settled and the authorities began their investigation, an unsettling realization began to emerge. The survivors' accounts of what had happened that night did not match the official reports. What was even more disturbing was that the discrepancies weren't just minor details. They were significant, impossible to ignore, and they pointed to a truth that nobody seemed willing to confront. It started with the basic facts. According to the official timeline, the fire began late at night, sparked by a short circuit in the building's aging electrical system. It spread quickly, catching the staff and patients off guard, and within hours the entire asylum was consumed by flames. The firefighters who arrived on the scene found the building engulfed, and many of the patients were either dead or badly injured. The survivors, they said, had managed to escape by sheer luck or with help from the staff who were able to lead them to safety. The fire was labeled as an accident, a tragedy caused by years of neglect, but the cause was simple enough to explain: poor maintenance, outdated wiring, and the overcrowded conditions that had made the building a tinderbox waiting to catch fire. But the survivors had a different story to tell. They spoke of chaos, of confusion, but they also spoke of things that seemed impossible. Some of them insisted that they had seen things: figures moving through the smoke, faces appearing in the flames. One woman recalled hearing the voice of a colleague who had died months before the fire, calling her name from within the smoke. Another survivor described a man they saw standing near the source of the fire, a man who was never identified in the official reports. They described the sound of footsteps in the halls, but there was no one there when they tried to find the source. In the midst of the destruction, they had seen shadows, figures who didn't belong, moving deliberately through the smoke as if they had some purpose other than escaping the fire. At first, these accounts were dismissed. They were chalked up to the trauma of the fire, the stress, the disorientation that naturally followed such a catastrophic event. The human mind, experts argued, was prone to distortion in times of crisis. But as more survivors began to speak up, their stories became too similar to ignore. It wasn't just one or two people with conflicting memories, it was a pattern that emerged across a wide range of individuals, each describing strange events and occurrences that the authorities couldn't explain. One survivor in particular stood out. She had been a nurse at the asylum for over a decade, and her recollections were both chilling and puzzling. She had been on duty the night of the fire, and while she spoke of the typical chaos and panic that everyone had witnessed, there were details in her account that set her apart from the others. She claimed that just before the fire began, she had seen a man standing at the end of the hallway, staring at her with an expression she would never forget. He had looked out of place, too well-dressed, too calm for someone who had just escaped a burning building. She tried to approach him, but he vanished into the smoke and she never saw him again. When she later tried to describe him, none of the survivors who had been in the building at the time could recall seeing anyone like him. His presence was inexplicable, as though he had never existed, yet the nurse swore she had seen him, felt his cold, unnerving gaze. Another survivor spoke of a similar experience. He had been on the lower floors of the asylum when the fire broke out, and his memories were just as fragmented and unreliable as the others. But what he remembered clearly was the sound of footsteps in the hall, rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly calm amid the chaos. He had assumed it was a staff member, perhaps someone coming to help him, but when he opened the door to the hallway, he found it empty. The footsteps had stopped and the hallway was eerily still, almost too still. No one else was there, no staff, no patients, just silence. It was as if the sound had come from nowhere. As the survivors continued to share their accounts, it became clear that something was deeply wrong with the official narrative. The reports claimed that the building staff had done everything they could to assist the patients, but the survivors' memories painted a different picture. Some recalled staff members who had abandoned their posts, leaving the patients to fend for themselves. Others spoke of hearing strange conversations between the staff just before the fire started, whispers that seemed to hint at something more sinister than mere negligence. One survivor, a former patient, claimed that they had overheard a conversation between two staff members about an experiment that was going to happen that night, something that had never been discussed before. They couldn't recall the details, but the word experiment had stuck in their mind, an unsettling thought that gnawed at them long after the fire had been extinguished. But the most disturbing accounts came from those who had witnessed the events firsthand. They spoke of figures in the fire, people they couldn't explain. These weren't mere shadows, nor were they the hallucinations one might expect from the smoke and heat. These were people, or at least figures that resembled people, moving through the fire with a strange, otherworldly calm. Some survivors said they had seen them up close, but when they tried to talk to them, they had disappeared into the smoke as if they had never been there. Others saw them from a distance, moving steadily through the flames, their features indistinct but unmistakably human. At first, the investigators tried to attribute these sightings to the smoke and the overwhelming panic that had taken over the building. The survivors, they reasoned, had been in shock, and their minds had played tricks on them. But the more they listened to the survivors, the more they began to question their initial conclusions. The survivors weren't just remembering things that weren't there, they were all recalling the same thing. These strange figures moving through the fire unaffected by the flames. The fact that so many people had described nearly identical experiences made it impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. As the investigation moved forward, the discrepancies in the survivors' accounts grew more significant. There were no clear explanations for the events they described. The official records, after all, didn't mention anything about strange figures or mysterious individuals moving through the fire. There were no reports of unexplained footsteps, no mention of a mysterious man in a suit standing in the hallway just before the fire. The authorities, desperate to close the case, continued to push the idea that the fire had been a tragic accident, a result of years of poor maintenance and overcrowding. But the survivors couldn't let go of what they had seen. They couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden in the shadows, something the fire had exposed but failed to fully reveal. The investigators were stuck. They had the facts, they had the timeline, but they didn't have the truth. As the weeks passed and the investigation continued, the survivors' accounts grew more complex, their memories more vivid. The fire had shattered their lives, but it had also awakened something within them, a need to understand what had truly happened. They weren't just looking for closure, they were searching for answers to questions that nobody seemed willing to ask. What had caused the fire? Why were so many people's memories of that night so different from the official reports? And most importantly, who were the figures that the survivors had seen in the fire, and what did they represent? Each new piece of information only deepened the mystery. As the survivors' memories converged around these strange figures, the investigators began to entertain the possibility that there was something more at play, something darker and more deliberate than an accident. But the answers they sought were elusive, buried beneath the layers of smoke and ash, lost to the flames. And as the survivors clung to their memories, they began to wonder. Were they the only ones who had seen these figures, or was there something bigger at play, something hidden in the ashes of the asylum that no one was willing to acknowledge? As the days turned into weeks following the fire, the investigation continued, but answers remained frustratingly elusive. The official report had already been drafted and filed, painting a clear picture of the tragic event, a catastrophic fire started by faulty wiring in the attic, exacerbated by the building's outdated infrastructure and lack of proper fire safety measures. The authorities declared the fire an accident, a result of years of neglect by the asylum's administration. Yet, despite the finality of the report, there were still lingering questions. Questions that no one seemed eager to answer, and answers that nobody seemed able to provide. The survivors were the first to speak up, their testimonies diverging sharply from the official narrative. As they began to recall their experiences in greater detail, investigators started to notice disturbing discrepancies that could not be brushed aside. How could so many people from different walks of life have such similar memories, if not for the fact that something had truly happened? What was it that made their recollections so at odds with the facts outlined in the report? It wasn't just one or two survivors, it was nearly every single person who had lived through the fire. Each story added a new layer to the mystery, hinting at a much darker truth that lay beneath the surface of the official explanation. One survivor, a man who had been living at the asylum for several years, described how he had been on the upper floors of the building when the fire began. The smoke had poured into the hall so quickly that he could barely see. Yet, what struck him most was the sense that something was wrong, something more than just a fire. He remembered hearing a woman's voice, calm and eerily soothing, calling out to him from the smoke. He had tried to find her, but the smoke was thick and visibility was near zero. The voice called again, but when he finally located its source, there was no one there. It wasn't the panic-induced hallucination that one might expect from someone under such stress. This was different. He knew he had heard it, had felt its presence in the thick smoke. Another survivor, a nurse who had worked at the asylum for over 10 years, recalled the very moment the fire broke out. Unlike others who had been caught off guard, She had seen the smoke rise from the attic and immediately realized what was happening. She had acted quickly, trying to get as many patients out as possible, but as she moved through the building she started to notice things that made her uneasy. She reported hearing muffled voices in the corridors, voices that sounded out of place, like they were not coming from anyone physically present in the building. In particular, she spoke of a man dressed in a suit who appeared just before the fire spread through the lower floors. She couldn't recall his face, but she was certain he had been there, moving in and out of the shadows. When she tried to approach him, he vanished, disappearing into the smoke. She had never seen him again. The investigator assigned to the case, Detective Ellis, found himself grappling with the survivors' accounts. As the days wore on, he was drawn deeper into the web of contradictions that surrounded the fire. He had expected a simple case, a tragic but straightforward story of negligence. But the more he delved into the survivors' stories, the more confused he became. Every person seemed to have their own version of events, yet they all shared one common thread: strange, inexplicable occurrences. Was this just the result of trauma, or was there something more behind it all? Detective Ellis decided to begin his own investigation into the asylum's history. What he found was deeply unsettling. The building, once hailed as a state-of-the-art mental institution, had long been plagued with problems. It had a history of mismanagement, with numerous reports of patients being neglected or mistreated. There were even whispers of illegal experiments conducted in secret, and of patients whose disappearances had never been explained. But what bothered Ellis the most was something more subtle, something he hadn't initially noticed. The reports of the fire mentioned nothing about the asylum's troubled past, nor did they make any reference to the growing concerns about the administration's practices in the years leading up to the incident. It was as if the fire had been completely divorced from the larger history of the institution, as if the investigation had purposefully ignored the deeper issues that had plagued the asylum for decades. He dug deeper, poring over old records and newspaper clippings, hoping to find a clue that might explain what had really happened that night. What he uncovered only added to the mystery. The asylum had a long history of accusations against its staff, many of them involving the mistreatment of patients, some of whom had been subjected to experimental treatments without their consent. There were reports of staff members using patients as guinea pigs for unapproved medications, drugs that had never been tested for safety or efficacy. Even more disturbing, there were rumors of a series of patients who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, their names removed from the official records, their families never informed. Were these disappearances connected to the fire? Did the fire, as the survivors seemed to believe, have a purpose beyond mere destruction? Ellis couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something much darker was at play. The official report insisted that the fire was an accident, a result of poor maintenance and neglect. But the survivors' testimonies, along with his own investigation, painted a different picture, one of a building that had been hiding secrets for years. Was the fire truly just a tragic accident, or was it a deliberate act to cover up something far more sinister? The detective turned his attention to the staff members who had been on duty the night of the fire. Many of them were now unavailable for questioning, having left the asylum shortly after the event. The few who remained were reluctant to talk, their stories filled with contradictions, their faces pale and nervous when asked about the night of the fire. One of the night nurses, when questioned about her role in evacuating the patients, claimed she had no memory of the events at all. Her face betrayed her, though. It was clear that she knew more than she was letting on. As Ellis pressed her for answers, she grew more evasive, her responses increasingly disjointed, until finally she became too agitated to continue the interview. The investigation was leading Ellis to a conclusion that he hadn't expected: a dark, twisted web of deceit that reached far beyond the walls of the asylum. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the fire had not been the result of mere negligence, but something far more calculated. The authorities were either blind to the truth or intentionally ignoring it, but Ellis was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. He could sense that the survivors were the key, their fragmented memories offering a piece of the puzzle that the official reports had tried to erase. As the investigation reached a boiling point, the detective found himself drawn to one final survivor, a man who had been found unconscious in the building after the fire had been extinguished. This man had been severely burned, his face and hands disfigured beyond recognition, but it was his memory that intrigued Ellis. Unlike the other survivors, this man had not been willing to speak at first, but after much persuasion he began to reveal fragments of his story. His account was more chilling than anything Ellis had heard before. He spoke of strange occurrences in the days leading up to the fire, of seeing staff members in places they should not have been, of hearing whispered conversations that sounded like planning rather than rescue. Most disturbing of all was his final revelation. He had seen the same figures that the others described, moving through the smoke, unaffected by the flames. The detective realized then that the fire wasn't just an accident, it was a calculated act, and the figures the survivors had seen were no mere hallucinations. They were connected to something far more sinister, something hidden deep within the asylum's walls. Ellis felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. What had happened at the asylum that night went beyond a tragic fire. It was part of a much larger, darker scheme, one that had been years in the making. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Ellis knew that the investigation was far from over. The truth, he now understood, was buried beneath layers of lies, cover-ups, and corruption. And though he was closer than ever to uncovering it, he also knew that some secrets were far too dangerous to reveal. The more the investigation unfolded, the deeper the mystery became. Detective Ellis had always prided himself on uncovering the truth, no matter how complex or dangerous the case might be, but what he was now uncovering within the asylum's history made him question whether he had stumbled onto something far more sinister than he had anticipated. The survivors' stories, bizarre and unsettling as they were, continued to point in the same direction, a series of connected events that had culminated in the fire, but the further he went, the more the lines between fact and fiction began to blur. As the weeks passed, the detective began to hone in on a single, disturbing possibility, that the fire had not been a random, catastrophic event. It had been set. The timing was too precise, the patterns too deliberate. The official reports had attributed the fire to faulty wiring, yet all the survivors' accounts seemed to contradict this. They spoke of things that should have been impossible. Figures moving through the fire unharmed, voices in the smoke, strange occurrences just before the blaze broke out. If the fire was indeed an accident, how could so many people remember the same disturbing images? How could their accounts align so perfectly despite the trauma, the smoke, and the chaos? Ellis's gut told him that this wasn't just about negligence, it was about something far darker, and the deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that the asylum's history held the key. He began to focus less on the immediate aftermath of the fire and more on the events leading up to it. That's when he uncovered the reports that had long been buried. Whispers of illegal experiments, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of cover-ups that spanned decades. What he discovered about the asylum's administration only deepened his suspicions. For years, there had been rumors of unethical medical experiments taking place behind closed doors. Staff members who had worked at the asylum in the years before the fire spoke of unapproved drug trials and experimental treatments being used on the patients without their consent. Some said they had seen patients who were never seen again, whose records had been erased, and whose families were never informed of their deaths. It was impossible to tell whether these were isolated incidents or part of a systematic effort to hide the truth. But the more Ellis heard, the more it became clear. Something had been happening inside that building that had been intentionally concealed from the public. As he pressed on, it became evident that the asylum was more than just a medical institution. It was a place of secrets, of corruption, and of power. The individuals running the asylum had more than just the care of their patients in mind. They had a far darker agenda, and the fire was, in many ways, the culmination of that agenda. But what was the purpose? What had they been hiding? And how had they managed to cover it up for so long? Ellis's investigation began to focus on a small group of staff members who had been in key positions within the asylum's administration in the years leading up to the fire. They were the ones who had been the most vocal in defending the official narrative, but Ellis soon learned that they had been some of the most involved in the asylum's shadowy dealings. One of them, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a senior psychiatrist who had worked at the asylum for over 20 years, seemed to be at the center of it all. Jenkins had been a highly respected figure within the medical community, known for his groundbreaking work on mental illness. However, as Ellis dug deeper, he began to uncover troubling details about Jenkins's personal history. There were rumors of patients who had been used in experimental procedures, unapproved treatments that had left them severely injured or dead. Some of the patients who had died under mysterious circumstances had been under Jenkins's direct care, but their deaths were never properly investigated. What disturbed Ellis the most was Jenkins's connection to the night of the fire. When the detective reviewed the timeline, he found that Jenkins had been working late that night, and several survivors reported seeing him in the building during the early hours of the fire. One survivor recalled seeing him moving calmly through the smoke, as if he had no fear of the flames. The survivor, a woman named Sarah, described how she had tried to call out to Jenkins when she saw him standing near a door that was supposed to be locked. But when she reached the door, it was wide open and Jenkins had disappeared. No one could confirm where he had been during the fire, and when the authorities later asked him about it, he claimed to have been in his office the entire time. But Ellis was convinced that Jenkins was lying. What followed was a careful examination of Jenkins's personal records. He had always been a secretive man, but Ellis managed to uncover a number of documents that shed light on his activities. In one of Jenkins's private journals, the detective found references to unapproved experiments and subjects in need of further observation. There were mentions of patients who had been accidentally exposed to dangerous chemicals, as well as a list of names that didn't match any of the patients officially recorded at the asylum. It was clear that Jenkins had been conducting experiments of a questionable nature, possibly on vulnerable patients who had been brought to the asylum from other institutions. But what was more disturbing was that some of the names in Jenkins's journal matched those of patients who had vanished from the asylum in the years prior to the fire. As Ellis began to connect the dots, he realized that the fire might have been orchestrated to cover up these experiments and the people who had gone missing. Perhaps it wasn't just an accident. Perhaps it was an attempt to destroy evidence, to erase the traces of a dark operation that had been running for years. But who else was involved? And how far did the conspiracy go? The detective's investigation led him to another troubling discovery: a series of strange, anonymous letters that had been sent to local newspapers in the months leading up to the fire. These letters, written in a cryptic and disjointed style, hinted at a reckoning within the asylum, a warning of something terrible that was about to unfold. The letters spoke of experiments gone wrong, of patients who had been manipulated and sacrificed for the sake of science, and of a coming disaster that would destroy everything. Was this a warning from someone on the inside, someone who had seen too much? Or was it part of a larger game, a psychological manipulation aimed at throwing the investigation off course? Ellis began to suspect that the fire had not only been an attempt to cover up the asylum's dark secrets, but also a calculated move to frame someone who had been a threat to those in power. Perhaps the survivor accounts of figures moving through the flames were not the hallucinations of traumatized minds but something far more deliberate. Perhaps those figures had been placed there to guide the fire, to ensure that it spread in the right direction and reached its intended victims. The more Ellis uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The asylum was not simply a place of care, it was a breeding ground for corruption, exploitation, and manipulation. And the fire was the cleansing, the final act in a series of events that had been carefully orchestrated from the shadows. But the question still remained: who was ultimately responsible for the fire? Jenkins was certainly a key figure, but was he the mastermind, or was he merely a pawn in a much larger game? As Ellis continued his investigation, he found himself running out of time. The official investigation was drawing to a close, and the authorities were eager to close the case and move on. But the detective knew that the truth was far from being fully uncovered. The asylum had been a place of untold suffering, and the fire had been only the beginning of a much darker story. He couldn't let it end here, not when so many lives had been ruined and so many questions remained unanswered. In the end, Ellis realized that the fire wasn't just about the destruction of a building. It was about erasing the past, hiding the truth, and ensuring that the secrets of the asylum would remain buried forever. But the survivors had seen something that would never be forgotten. And as long as those memories remained, the truth would continue to haunt the walls of the asylum, even as the building itself was reduced to ashes. As the investigation progressed, Detective Ellis found himself walking a fine line between what was officially accepted as the truth and the disturbing alternate reality that the survivors were so desperate to reveal. He had uncovered enough to know that there was something deeply wrong with the asylum, something that had been buried so thoroughly that even those who had lived through its horrors seemed unwilling or unable to speak freely about it. The fire had erased many of the physical traces, but the memories, fragments of broken lives, whispered truths, remained. Each day, as Ellis spoke to more survivors, it became clearer that the fire was not just a tragic accident, but the culmination of something far darker. One of the most chilling revelations came when Ellis sat down with a man named Thomas, a former patient who had spent years at the asylum. Thomas had been one of the few who had escaped the fire unscathed, though his mind had never fully recovered from his time in the institution. He had been released only months before the fire broke out, after a prolonged stay that left him physically and emotionally scarred. His account was fragmented, his memories jumbled, but the pieces he was able to recall painted a disturbing picture of what had been happening behind the asylum's locked doors. Thomas spoke of an increasing sense of unease in the months leading up to the fire. He described how the staff had become more secretive, more distant, as though they were preparing for something. He also recalled overhearing hushed conversations late at night, staff members talking in low voices, whispering about the experiment. What experiment Thomas was referring to, he couldn't say for sure, but the word had stuck in his mind as it had for so many others. Some survivors had mentioned similar conversations, but none could provide specifics. The fact that these whispers persisted among different patients and staff members only deepened Ellis's suspicions that the fire had been part of a larger, more calculated effort to conceal something. There was one night, Thomas recalled, when he overheard something that made his blood run cold. He had been lying in his room, unable to sleep, when he heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, he thought it was just another restless patient, but when the steps came closer, he realized that the sound was deliberate, purposeful. It was then that he saw a shadow pass by his door, a figure he recognized but couldn't place. The figure was moving quickly, but Thomas had never seen anyone move like that before, so quietly, so swiftly. He tried to call out, but before he could, the figure disappeared into the darkness. In the days that followed, things began to escalate. More patients were moved into the isolation wing, a section of the asylum that had been previously closed off to the general population. No one knew why and no one dared ask. The staff grew even more guarded and rumors spread like wildfire. But the most unsettling thing was the sudden increase in strange behaviors among the staff. Some were seen talking to themselves, others wandering the halls in a daze, and a few were even reported to have had conversations with patients who were known to have died months earlier. It was as though the asylum had been gripped by an invisible force, one that no one seemed able to resist. Ellis was becoming increasingly convinced that the fire wasn't just an accident or the result of neglected infrastructure. There was a hidden agenda, something that had been brewing in the shadows of the asylum for years. As he pieced together the survivors' accounts, it became clear that there was something more to the so-called experiments than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. The idea that the fire was a cover-up began to take shape in his mind. But why would the fire be set in the first place? What was it that the asylum's administration wanted to hide so badly? As Ellis dug deeper into the asylum's records, he came across a particularly chilling discovery, a series of documents that had been marked classified and hidden away in the administrative offices. These documents referenced something called Project Solace, a program designed to experiment with alternative treatments for mental illness, many of which had been deemed too controversial for mainstream use. Some of the treatments included experimental drugs, invasive procedures, and even electroshock therapies that were far more extreme than anything legally approved. The project's records were sparse, and many of the patients involved had been listed under false names, their true identities obscured. It was clear that the program had been operating in secret, its true nature hidden from the public. But it was the final report on Project Solace that gave Ellis pause. The report detailed the use of a particular chemical substance, one that had been tested on several patients who were described as unfit for regular treatment. The chemical, according to the report, had been administered to induce heightened states of awareness and compliance, though the long-term effects were unknown. The report, dated just a month before the fire, mentioned a sudden spike in adverse reactions among the test subjects, several of whom had reportedly exhibited signs of violent outbursts, paranoia, and hallucinations. But the most troubling part of the report was the final note: subject to be discarded. That phrase haunted Ellis. Subject to be discarded. What did it mean? Was it a euphemism for something far more sinister? Ellis felt as though the walls were closing in on him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the fire had not been a random accident. It was a calculated act of destruction, a way to erase the evidence of something far darker than anyone had imagined. The subjects involved in these experiments had been discarded like so much refuse, their lives considered expendable for the sake of whatever twisted research the asylum's administrators had been conducting. But the fire had not only consumed the building, it had consumed the very truth of what had been happening inside. It had been a way to destroy the evidence, to eliminate anyone who might have known too much. The survivors, it seemed, were the only ones left to tell the story. With his mounting evidence, Ellis began to confront the surviving staff members. Some of them had already left the asylum, vanishing without a trace, but others remained unwilling to speak. One nurse, a woman named Evelyn, had worked at the asylum for over 20 years. She was among the few who had stayed on after the fire, her role in the aftermath of the disaster minimized to that of a low-level administrator. When Ellis approached her for questioning, she was quiet at first, her face betraying nothing. But as he probed deeper, she began to break down. She confessed that she had seen things during her time at the asylum, things that made her question everything she thought she knew about her profession. She spoke of the patients who had been subjected to unapproved treatments, of the secrecy surrounding the administration's operations, and of the strange experiments that had been conducted in the isolation wing. But when Ellis pressed her about the fire, Evelyn grew silent. "I can't say what I don't know," she finally whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But I can tell you this, there was something in that building. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it wasn't just the fire. It was something else. Something we couldn't stop." Her words, cryptic and evasive, left Ellis with more questions than answers. What was it that she couldn't say? What had she witnessed? And why was she so afraid to speak the truth? As Ellis continued his search for the truth, he realized that the answers he sought would not come easily. The deeper he dug, the more layers of deception he uncovered. The asylum was a place of secrets, and those who held the power to protect those secrets were willing to go to any lengths to ensure that they remained buried. The fire, as devastating as it had been, was only the beginning of a much larger story, a story that, if fully revealed, could bring down an entire system. And for Ellis, it was clear that the truth was slipping further and further from his grasp. But even as the investigation faltered, one thing was certain: the survivors were not going to let the truth die with them. They were the key to unlocking the dark history of the asylum, and as long as they lived, the secrets of that night would never be forgotten. As the investigation wore on, Detective Ellis felt himself sinking deeper into a sea of contradictions, unable to break free from the complex web of lies that had been spun around the asylum fire. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces seemed to scatter, leaving him unsure of what was real and what had been fabricated. The survivors' memories, vivid and fragmented as they were, pointed to something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Yet each new discovery only raised more questions, leading him to a terrifying realization: the fire was merely the tip of the iceberg, a calculated act to cover up a much larger, more insidious operation that had been going on for years. In the weeks following his most recent discoveries, Ellis began to connect the dots between the asylum's troubling history, the survivors' testimonies, and the damning evidence he had uncovered from the asylum's records. The fire, he now believed, was not an isolated event but the final act in a long series of cover-ups designed to keep the truth hidden from the public. What was even more alarming was the possibility that the people behind the fire were still at large, moving in the shadows, orchestrating events to ensure that the truth remained buried forever. The deeper Ellis dug into the asylum's past, the more he realized that the building had been more than just a place of treatment for the mentally ill. It had become a breeding ground for something darker, a site for secret experiments, covert operations, and illegal activities that had been conducted under the guise of psychiatric care. The administration had gone to great lengths to cover up their actions, manipulating the system to protect themselves and their research. The patients, often seen as nothing more than expendable subjects, had become pawns in a much larger game, one that no one outside the asylum had any knowledge of. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence that Ellis had come across was the testimony of a former staff member, a man named Peter, who had worked in the asylum's isolation wing during the final months before the fire. Peter had been one of the few to witness firsthand the bizarre and unnerving experiments that were taking place behind closed doors. He spoke of patients being subjected to strange, unapproved treatments that had no basis in medical science. These treatments, Peter explained, were designed to alter the patient's mental states, to push them beyond their limits, and to observe the results. Some of the patients had been given experimental drugs, while others had been subjected to extreme sensory deprivation. The purpose, Peter believed, was to see how far they could push the human mind before it cracked. What was even more disturbing was the fact that these experiments had been conducted under the supervision of some of the asylum's most respected medical professionals. These were not just rogue staff members acting outside the law. They were people who had been given complete control over the lives of the patients, people who had used their positions of authority to carry out unspeakable acts. Dr. Robert Jenkins, the senior psychiatrist whose involvement in the asylum's operations had already raised red flags for Ellis, had been one of the central figures in these experiments. According to Peter, Jenkins had been obsessed with finding new ways to treat mental illness, no matter the cost. He had believed that the end justified the means, that the pursuit of knowledge was more important than the well-being of the patients. Peter described one experiment in particular that haunted him to this day. It had involved a patient named Emily, a young woman who had been institutionalized for severe depression. Jenkins and his team had decided to administer a new drug, one that had never been tested on humans before, to see how it would affect Emily's mental state. The drug was a powerful stimulant, designed to heighten the patient's senses and increase their alertness. But instead of the desired effect, the drug caused Emily to become violently agitated. Her heart rate spiked and she began to experience hallucinations. The staff, rather than intervening, had simply watched, taking notes as Emily spiraled into a frenzy. Peter recalled that the other patients had been terrified, some of them begging the staff to help, but Jenkins had insisted that the experiment must continue. Emily's condition worsened rapidly, and within hours she had collapsed, her body shutting down under the strain of the drug. She died within the next 24 hours, but her death was never reported as an adverse reaction. Instead, the incident was swept under the rug, and Emily's file was altered to reflect that she had simply died of natural causes. The more Ellis listened to Peter's testimony, the more he understood that the fire had not just been a tragic accident. It had been an attempt to destroy the evidence of these experiments, to erase the memory of those who had died as a result of the asylum's dark practices. The administration had known that they were skating on thin ice, that the public could no longer be kept in the dark about the horrors taking place inside the asylum. The fire had been their way of covering up their tracks, of making sure that no one would ever find out the true extent of the atrocities that had been committed under their watch. As Ellis continued to investigate, he began to feel the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on him. It was clear that the fire had been deliberately set, and the survivors' testimonies were the only evidence that could expose the truth. But as more people began to come forward with their own recollections, it became apparent that the fire was not the end of the story, it was merely the beginning. The survivors, many of whom had spent years in the asylum, had witnessed things that went far beyond the fire itself. Some spoke of strange figures who had appeared during the blaze, figures that had moved through the smoke and flames as though they were untouchable. These figures had been seen by multiple survivors, but no one could identify them. Were they hallucinations, the result of smoke inhalation or trauma? Or were they something else entirely, something that the survivors couldn't fully comprehend? Ellis was particularly struck by the testimony of one survivor, a woman named Sarah, who had been a patient at the asylum for over a decade. She had been one of the first to escape the fire, but even after her release, her mind had never fully recovered. Sarah spoke of seeing a man in a suit standing near the epicenter of the fire, his face obscured by the smoke. She described him as cold, detached, almost otherworldly in his calmness. Sarah had tried to speak to him, but when she approached, he simply disappeared into the haze as though he had never been there. She wasn't the only one to have seen him. Several other survivors had described the same figure, a man who seemed out of place, who moved through the fire with a chilling sense of purpose. Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that the fire had been orchestrated by someone with knowledge of the asylum's inner workings, someone who had been able to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The question was, who? Was it Jenkins, the senior psychiatrist who had overseen so many of the asylum's dark practices? Or was it someone else, someone higher up in the hierarchy, pulling the strings from behind the scenes? Ellis's instincts told him that the truth was more complicated than it seemed. There were too many unanswered questions, too many conflicting testimonies, and too much secrecy surrounding the asylum's administration for the case to be solved easily. The more Ellis tried to peel back the layers of the conspiracy, the more he realized that the fire was just one part of a much larger story. The asylum had been a place where people were manipulated, experimented on, and discarded like lab rats, all in the name of science and control. The survivors were the only ones left to tell the story, and their accounts were the key to unlocking the truth.